Hi guys and welcome to Karlpopewoodcraft. I'm Karl. Today's video I'm going to be building this urn, and before we start the build I just want to talk about a couple of things about the channel. I'll put the timing up here somewhere if you want to skip straight to the build of the urn, but if you're interested a little bit more in the channel then stick around just for a minute or so. So first of all, I've got the giveaway that's coming up, and when we hit the 200 subscriber mark, that'll be 2,400 I believe, we're going to do a giveaway, and I'm making something especially for that giveaway. And the way you enter that is by getting a friend or family member, somebody who enjoys making woodworking along them lines, and telling them about the channel, and they will subscribe and comment and mention your name, and that's how you get into the hat for the draw. So that's that. The next thing is I've now got a Patreon account, so if you'd like to become a Patreon and support the channel, you can via the Patreon app, and I'll leave a link just below in the description for you to follow that. I'd like to say thanks to the new members who already took me up on the offer to join the Patreon party, and that's great, and I'm looking forward to making new Patreon only content on a monthly basis. And that's everything covered there, guys, and we'll move straight on to the build. And just a little bit about the materials that I've used for this build. Then I've used some American white oak left over from a table build, and I've also used a small sheet of birch plywood, what I had left over from a previous project as well. So that's what it's constructed out of, and I'll show you the design now and then we'll move on to the build. This is the plan of the build, guys, and you can see the dimensions here which changed during the build, but you'll see more of that later. And we've got the birch plywood of the main construction, and then we have the trim of the solid American white oak. All the joints are mitred, and then we've got a nice OG moulding on the American white oak, and everything is stained with a medium oak. The first thing I did was go over to the miter saw with a piece of birch plywood. I cut the birch plywood down to some rough dimensions, and then I went over to the table saw and cut it to its final width. We then moved over back to the miter saw again, and we started the procedure of cutting out the miters. I first cut a miter on one side, and then I marked the final distance from that first initial miter, and then we cut the second miter, and that's that complete. Just dusted them all off, and we're going to have a dry assemble, check the miters are all nice, so just flip it over. I'm also going to try and match the grain as best I can on the back before we add the glue. Fold this up now and see if it all comes together nicely. All four miter joints looked great on the dry fit, so I carried on to the next stage, which was gluing up the miters. I put a generous bead of glue on each side of the miter, and I made sure I covered every bit of surfaced area. I then folded up the box on itself, and I used the frog tape to pull it all nice and tight. The frog tape's great because it's really stretchy and you can pull the joints nice and tight. I then put a few F-clamps on just to nip it up a little bit more. I left the miters to dry for 24 hours, and then I checked on the following day and they all looked great. I then started on the plinth of the box, and I marked out the square of the inside of the urn, and then I found the centre of that by using a ruler and marking from corner to corner. I then found the Forstner bit, which was the size I needed, and I just made a point in the centre of there for the drill bit to follow. I cut out approximately 5mm into the plinth of the box, and this was in order to fit the little glass bowl that the ashes was going to sit into in there nice and neatly and snug. I used some sticky felt to line the plinth of the box, and I simply drew around this on the inside of the box again with a pencil and cut it out with scissors. The felt wasn't great quality, and it was a good job I had some really sharp scissors, as it frayed really easily. I then removed the self-adhesive backing, and I placed this onto the I placed the felt onto the plinth for the box. I pressed the felt down firmly with my hand, especially in the area that we'd cut out with the forcing bit where the bottle was going to sit. I then applied a good bead of glue around the bottom of the plinth, and I then fastened it to the top with some brad nails. These won't be seen as this is going to be covered with some black felt later. The glass jar had a gold and red lid, so I removed this and took it outside and gave it a couple of coats of a black spray lacquer. I then went back inside, and for the plinth, which was just cut oversized, I needed to remove the excess with a flush bit on the router. We then glued the jar inside the urn with some epoxy. And as you can see now, the ashes are actually in the jar, so I give the jar a good polish off, and the urn has been hoovered out so it's all nice and clean inside, because the lid is going to get put onto the top of the urn now, and then it's going to be glued on and secured as a permanent fixture. Next I move back over to the table saw, and I'm using the American white oak, and I'm cutting this down to the dimensions which are the same as the birch plywood. As you can see, I'm just putting a piece of birch plywood in between the blade of the table saw and the fence. This will then enable me to be able to trim the end grain of the birch plywood, and we'll be able to put a nice bit of moulding around the edge of the box to finish it off nicely. And then I used a combination of PVA wood glue and super glue. I didn't use any activator because I wanted to position the lid perfectly so I could come back later with a flush trim bit in the router to flush everything up nicely. I put a bit of weight on it just for 5 minutes to let the super glue hold, and then I started routing the OG moulding on the bits of oak that are going to be positioned on the bottom of the plinth. The moulding had to be routed onto these pieces first because you wouldn't be able to get the router in position when these are fixed. So this was quite awkward, but with the help of a clamp and just going nice and steady, I was able to do this, and I stayed well clear of the edges so the router didn't catch. Next, I used the miter saw to put a 45-degree angle on all these pieces, and I actually swapped the blade out, which was a 40-tooth blade, and I put this 80-tooth blade in because it gave me a lot neater cut with minimal tear out on the American white oak, so that was a lot better than the 40-tooth blade. I then used PVA glue and brad nails to attach the moulding. If you're interested in this brad nailer, what I'm using here, I did a full review on the Von House brad nailer, and I'll leave that in the description below. I also countersinked with a hole punch the brad nails so I could later fill them with some wood filler. And for the first time, one of the brads didn't actually fire in properly with this brad nailer, and I had to pull it out with the pincers, but that was no problem at all. I then mixed some pine wood filler with some of the medium oak stain that we're going to be using, and this helped to disguise the filler quite well. And later on, when we applied the wood dye, these was barely visible whatsoever. For the trim that was going to be attached to the top, I didn't have to put the moulding on prior to fixing. So I cut the miters and I attached with PVA glue and super glue, and I also used the activator this time so I could get an instant bond. This meant I could get straight on with the router and put the moulding around the trim. I then did a little light hand sanding
and then I used the random orbital sander just to clean up any uneven bits, which there was very minimal of. I used 240 grit straight away because everything was quite smooth, and then I used some sandpaper rolled around a pencil so I could get right into the moulding. I made sure the surface was fully clean before applying the wood dye, and I used a little katsu blower to blow any bits of dust off and then give everything a hoover with the soft attachment on the hose. I then applied the medium oak wood dye, and this is really easy to apply. You just apply plenty on with a cloth and then wipe the excess straight off, and remembering to go into the direction of the grain when you're wiping off. And I wanted this a little bit darker, so I applied a second and then a third coat. After applying the wood dye, I let the end dry for 24 hours, and then we applied some shellac. Now, you don't see here, but the shellac was a bit of a disaster, and I didn't notice, but it must have gone off at some stage, and you can see it goes on really nicely, and then within 15 minutes everything's really cloudy and patchy. So I had to clean it off with some white spirits. I explain a little bit more about what I used instead of the shellac at the end of the video. For the underside of the box, I attached the same red felt that I put inside the box, and this was quite easy to cut this time as I used a really sharp Stanley knife and a metal ruler, and any excess I just trimmed off around the bottom of the box. And one of the last jobs left to do was to attach the plaque. I used the combination square just to centralise it, and then just did some tiny marks with a pencil where I could come back later. I used a cabinet scraper and some sandpaper to remove any finish so I could get a proper adhesion with the super glue when I attach it in a moment. I put plenty of this super glue on the back of the plaque, but I don't use any activator as I want to be able to move it around just to reposition it perfectly at this stage. I then put a little bit of activator on just around the edges just to secure it permanently into position. And last but not least, I give everything a nice polish, and then I apply some furniture wax on the urn just to give it a little satin sheen, and that's the urn complete.
Here's the urn all completed then, guys. I'm quite happy with it, and I think my mother-in-law Jean's going to love it. Something nice to remember her son by, and at least now she can put him on the mantelpiece and he'll be there always with her. Is there anything particular I like about it? I think the mitres turned out great. There wasn't a single gap in any of them, so that's a real good positive. Is there anything that went wrong or I could have done better? I'm a bit disappointed that on some of the mitres, it's hard to see on camera, but on some of the mitres, some of the glue must have soaked in around the edges because the stain didn't take great in them areas. I can notice it, I don't think many other people will, but I did wipe the glue off and I sanded down, so you know I need to take more care again where the glue spills out in future. Also, one thing that I'll tell you about the shellac finish, it's not on the video because at the time I was a bit stressed and I just wanted to get it done. I put the shellac on, left it for half an hour, came back and it was all white and smeary. Now, if you're in the UK at the minute, you probably know it's really humid, so I'm putting it down to the shellac maybe going off, and yeah, it just went really white, smeary, and I did a bit of research and it looks like in humid conditions that can happen. Luckily enough, shellac's really easy to take off with some white spirits, so I scrubbed it down with 3 or 4 goes of white spirits with some kitchen roll, and then I applied the hard wax oil, what I normally use on my tabletops, what I do, and that gives a nice finish first time. and then as you can see at the end, I've just applied a bit of polished furniture wax on there, and yeah, I think that's give a good finish anyway. And I threw the shellac away because I think it had gone off. But that's it for today, guys. I appreciate you watching the build, and I'll catch you on the next one. Bye for now.